Good morning and welcome to another Pastor's Ponderings. For this one, I want to give a shout out to Joyanne Hamilton. She's one of our faithful sisters who is up in Alaska, but she's been attending our services and attending our Bible studies online, and it's been a joy to have her with us. As we went through our Foundations of the Faith study, which you can find online if you're interested in it. We talked about the foundation of what we believe as God's people. And so as we went through that, one of the big topics that came up was the Lord's Supper. We discussed what does it mean to be worthy to come to the Lord's Supper, and different aspects of that. As we wrestled with that, Joyanne brought up a very curious question, and I think it's a really fun question to wrestle with, and I thank you, Joyanne. I'm sorry I couldn't give you an answer right when you asked it, but it really got me doing a lot of studying and a lot of wrestling myself. So I think I've finally gotten to the point where I've got a satisfactory answer for this, and so I wanted to share it with all of you. But the question you had pointed out was, why does Jesus seemingly commune Judas at the Lord's Supper? And it's such a fascinating question because as LCMS Lutherans, we tend to be a little bit careful about who is allowed to come to the meal and who isn't, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the end of this discussion. But it's a good question that you ask, and so I started looking at the gospel accounts. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us a pretty decent timeline before or during the first part of the meal, before Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. Judas says, or Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." And all of the disciples begin this big ruckus. Well, who, Lord? Who? Is surely not me. And Jesus says, "The one who dips bread into the bowl with me." And I always kind of laughed at that because Jesus makes that announcement, and then in Matthew it kind of points out right away that then Judas dips his hand into the bowl with Jesus. It's like, if you heard him, you wouldn't have necessarily given yourself away, right? Um, but there's obviously more going on there. There's more details going on there. But nevertheless, Judas is outed in this conversation. Now, in the first three, there's no mention of his departing, right? In Matthew, Mark, Luke, there's no mention of him departing. It goes right from Jesus outs him to the Lord's Supper. Okay? But in John, right? John is that strange feller in the room, the stranger of the Gospels, uh, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke. We talk about them as the synoptic Gospels. They share a lot of the same stories, a lot of the commonalities. John is a bit of a stranger bird. It has different stories and it has different focuses, and we appreciate that, but it kind of causes it to stand out. Well, John doesn't actually have the Lord's Supper account within it. I know. Isn't that weird? It doesn't have the Lord's Supper account with it. At least not quite as definitive as Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. It does have the upper room, however, and it brings up the point that Judas is indeed outed in that. And it in the when Judas is outed, Jesus says in that John account, "Go and do what you must." And immediately Judas leaves. Now, that creates for an interesting timeline because if we try to understand John and the synoptic gospels together as one cohesive narrative, one could say that Judas was not even there for the institution of the Lord's Supper. It's interesting to talk about. The reality is that we're not sure exactly how that timeline played out, and if we needed to know, well, I suppose the good Lord would have told us in definitive detail. The reality is that that particular time isn't what's really important here. But let's say, for the sake of this discussion, that Judas was there for the Lord's Supper and that Jesus did commune him. I think one of the things that we need to always remember is that we have to take Scripture as a whole, right? We can't just pull out specific stories and take them to mean something important and then ignore the rest, right? That's a very dangerous way to create theology. And so we cannot disregard Paul's writings on the Lord's Supper just because of this particular story, at which we are already missing a lot of the details. But it does bring up an interesting point. Why does Jesus commune Judas? Okay. Well, I think the first thing that we need to point out is that this is the Passover meal, right? While this is the place in which Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, it is not the celebration of the Lord's Supper as we know it today. Okay? That's one thing that we need to point out. For Jesus to dismiss Judas early, which we're not saying that he didn't, right? According to that John account, he very well might have. But to dismiss him early would be very strange and very out of the ordinary. And it probably would have affected the disciples in an incredibly negative way. But I mean, Jesus had already outed him. It's a challenge. You know, when I was wrestling with this, one of the things that I thought was, if Jesus had outed me as the betrayer, would I want to stay at that point? Now the disciples know that I'm going to be the one to betray him. They probably don't understand the implications of that completely, but they probably don't want me around anymore. I would have left. It's a challenge. It really is a challenge. I know one of the other thoughts that I had thought about was that Judas is already condemned, right? It's already condemned. Jesus had said it would be better if Judas had never been born for the suffering that he will face. And it kind of breaks your heart for Judas and for that whole thing. But nevertheless, let's say that Jesus does commune him. In that way, right, it doesn't become a very formative statement for us. It doesn't teach us how we should or should not welcome people to the table. That's not the point of this story, right? It's not the point of that Jesus is trying to make here. He is trying to establish this as a wonderful rite by which we would receive his good gifts and forgiveness, love, or forgiveness, life, and salvation in that sacrament. Here he establishes the new covenant. That is the point that is to be made. And if we have any takeaway, we should take it away from there. However, we cannot contrast this with Paul and say that this somehow invalidates what Paul says. Paul's words are much more instructive. They're very focused on how we ought to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. And he warns that whoever eats or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. And he even says down below, he says, for anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. Right? These are the words that cause us to have concern for who comes to the table. Right? Well, what is then the solution? Well, he gives that too. Let a person examine himself or herself, and so eat and drink the cup in a worthy manner. Right? This is the focus. When we come to that table, we come to it in a worthy manner. We examine ourselves. When we see the true meaning behind the Lord's Supper, and we come there as repentant sinners. The reality is that the Lord's Supper is for sinners. It's for those who are repenting, who need God's mercy and grace. What does that mean for Judas? Well, I don't know. Perhaps that's for God to decide. But we take our practice, we take our instruction from Paul in this way, because we do have concern. We do have love for those who would come to the table. And we need to address that with them. We need to make sure that they are indeed receiving the Lord's Supper in a worthy manner, at least the best that we possibly can. At some point, it is always on the person who comes forward. Right? But we do everything that we can to make sure that they receive the body and blood in a worthy manner. That way, they do not receive that condemnation that God, that Paul points out, the judgment from our Heavenly Father. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing. And, in America now, it's become the common practice just to let anybody come to the table. And it's become very uncommon to restrict those who are coming to the table. But I think, another thing that we need to remember is that for, 1,800 years? For 1,800 years, the church has practiced communion in this way, restricting those who are not worthy to come to the table to not come to the table for 1,800 years. And for evangelical America to push back on that, for us to begin to question those convictions, it's a bit short-sighted at times. I'm not saying that a lot of their ideas are invalid. It is good for us to be welcoming, and it's good for us to love them and accept them as part of our family as well. But we also have to be careful. Be careful that as they come forward, that they are treating the Lord's Supper with the respect that it deserves, and that they aren't eating or drinking the Lord's Supper for condemnation on themselves. What that looks like, I'm afraid I don't understand fully either. St. Paul gives an example, though, in the book of Acts, of someone who eats or drinks or who consumes the sacrament and dies because of it. Dies because of that, because of their unworthiness. I think it's important for us to make sure that we treat this with respect. And as we look at the Lord's Supper, we need to recognize that asking people not to come forward, it's not being unwelcoming. It's being loving. They may not fully grasp that right now, but it's something we need to wrestle with. Right? That balance of being welcoming and loving, and yet watching out for them when they walk into something that they don't know or fully understand. It's a hard line to walk, and yet I think we can do it faithfully. I think we can do a good job of it. Yeah. Thank you for wrestling with me today, or I guess not wrestling with me, but wrestling with this topic with me today. There's a lot more to understand, and I'm not sure that we're all going to fully grasp this concept ever. Right? But at least we can ponder it, and we can allow it to affect the way that we practice our faith together. God's peace to all of you, and please feel free to comment below if you have any questions or thoughts on the matter, or if you wish to discuss this further, you can always reach out to me. God's blessings to you all, and take care.